The IPCC report before us today is a powerful evidence that we have the great potential to mitigate climate change. We are at a crossroads. This is the time for action. We have the tools and know-how to limit warming and secure a livable future. This Working Group 3 report provides the most recent scientific knowledge on the mitigation of climate change.
Dear participants of the IPCC Working Group 3 press conference, we are at the moment facing very challenging times. We have learned from about this brutal war in Ukraine, which also has an impact on the media environment, and that has meant that attention to this long-term major challenge for the welfare of humankind and biosphere has been a little bit lower than it used to be before this war. And in the best case, this would speed up the reduction of the use of fossil energy and also speed up green transition. In the worst case, interest to mitigate climate change will be challenged because of this development.
This report tells us that we're still not doing enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Half measures will not halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The IPCC tells us that we have the knowledge and the technology to get this done through a rapid shift from fossil fuels to renewable and alternative fuels, through moving from deforestation to restoration, through backing nature in our landscapes, oceans, and cities, through transforming our cities into green and clean spaces, and through behavior changes to address the demand side of the equation. But increased action must begin this year, not next year, this month, not next month, and indeed today, not tomorrow. Otherwise, we will, as the UN Secretary General put it, continue to sleepwalk into a climate catastrophe.
I'm encouraged by the increasing number of countries taking ambitious climate actions. There are policies, regulations, and market instruments that are proving effective. If these are scaled up and applied more widely, they can support deep emissions reductions and stimulate innovation.
We are pleased to present the findings of this Working Group 3 assessment of the mitigation of climate change. Now, our assessment was prepared by 278 authors from 65 countries. We reviewed more than 18,000 scientific papers and considered close to 60,000 individual comments from governments and experts as part of the drafting process. Now, the reality is that greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing global warming, are at their highest levels in human history. Emissions in 2019 were about 12% higher than they were in 2010 and 54% higher than in 1990. So we are definitely not on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But there is increased evidence of climate action, and the average annual rate of growth in global emissions has slowed in the last decade. Despite this progress, our assessment concludes that unless there are immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. Some countries have achieved a steady decrease in emissions over several years at rates consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees, and a growing number of cities are setting net zero target. An increased range of policies and laws have enhanced energy efficiency, reduced rates of deforestation, and accelerated the deployment of renewable energy. And climate laws that result in reduced or avoided emissions are present in 56 countries, covering more than half of global emissions. One notable success is around renewable energy. Since 2010, there have been sustained decreases in unit costs, with reductions of 85% for solar energy, 55% for wind power, and 85% for batteries. And in some cases, costs have fallen below those of fossil fuels. And at the same time, we've seen big increases in installed capacity, as this figure shows. Now, looking at policies that were implemented by December 2020, we conclude that, without strengthening mitigation efforts, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to lead to warming of 3.2 degrees. In the scenarios we assessed, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. Emissions from methane, a short-lived but very potent greenhouse gas, would also need to be reduced by about a third over the same period. And even if we do this, it is almost inevitable that we will at least temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees warming, but we could return below this level by the end of the century. Now, limiting warming to around 2 degrees still requires global emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by about a quarter by 2030. Now, the temperature will stabilise when we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions. Deep and sustained reductions of other gases would also be required. So how do we go about reducing these emissions?
In every sector, there are options available that can at least halve emissions by 2030. The energy sector accounts for about a third of all emissions, and major transitions are required to limit global warming. This will involve a substantial reduction in fossil fuel use, low or no carbon energy systems, widespread electrification, use of alternative fuels such as hydrogen and sustainable biofuels, use of carbon capture and storage, and improved energy efficiency. Changes to our lifestyles and behavior can reduce our carbon footprint, as well as improve our health and well-being. There is untapped potential here to bring down global emissions by between 40 and 70% by 2050. Of the 60 actions we assessed in this report, on an individual level, the biggest contribution comes from switching to walking and cycling and using electrified transport. Other effective options include reducing air travel and adapting our houses. Shifting towards balanced, plant-based diets is an option. Wealthier individuals have the highest potential for reductions as investors, consumers, role models, and professionals. To be effective, lifestyle changes will need to be supported by systemic changes across every aspect of society. Looking at the transport sector, reducing demand plays an important part in reducing emissions, and low-carbon technologies are also key. Electric vehicles offer the greatest potential, as long as they are combined with low or zero carbon electricity sources. In aviation and shipping, which are harder to decarbonize, alternative fuels, such as low-emission hydrogen and biofuels, would be needed. In all cities, better urban planning is key. 3 other broad strategies have been found to be effective. These include sustainable consumption and production of goods and services, electrification, and improving carbon uptake and storage in cities, for example, with trees, lakes, green roofs, and permeable surfaces. In buildings, it is possible to reach net zero emissions in 2050. There is an increasing number of net zero and net zero energy and net zero carbon buildings in almost all climates. More could be done to reduce emissions in this sector if renovation rates and retrofitting were improved. Reducing emissions in industry will involve using materials and energy more efficiently, reusing and recycling products, and minimizing waste. For basic materials, including steel, building materials, and chemicals, low to zero greenhouse gas production processes are at their pilot or near commercial stage. Achieving net zero will be challenging, and will require new production processes, low and zero emissions electricity, hydrogen, and, where necessary, carbon capture and storage. To counterbalance hard to eliminate emissions, for example, from agriculture, aviation, and some industrial processes, requires carbon dioxide removal. There are biological methods that can store carbon, such as reforestation and soil carbon management. New technologies, such as direct air capture and storage, require more research, upfront investment, and proof of concept at larger scales before they can be widely used. Carbon dioxide removal is essential to achieve net zero. Agriculture, forestry, and other land use can provide large-scale emissions reductions and remove and store carbon dioxide at scale. This can be done by protecting and restoring natural ecosystems. Improved and sustainable crop and livestock management can also play a part. But land can only do so much in terms of removing and storing carbon, and cannot compensate for delayed emission reductions in other sectors.
Our assessment shows that financial flows are a factor of 3 to 6 times lower than levels needed by 2030 to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. But there is sufficient global capital available and liquidity to close investment gaps. Clear signaling from government and the international community, including a strong alignment of public sector finance and policies, is critically important. The challenge of closing gaps is widest for developing countries due to the limited capacities of these countries. Regulatory and economic instruments have already proved effective in reducing emissions. Such measures can be strengthened and expanded significantly. Policy packages and economy-wide packages are better able to achieve systematic change than individual policy instruments on their own. Investment and policies, especially for scientific training as well as research and development, push forward low-emission technological innovation. Some options are technically viable, increasing cost-effective, and generally supported by the public, which enables development in many regions. We show how mitigation goes hand in hand with achieving many of the Sustainable Development Goals.
What this report has done is to show how taking action now can move us towards a fairer and more livable world. And so just to sum it all up, we know what to do, we know how to do it, and now it's up to us to take action.